Chapter 15 of The Valley of Silent Men. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Valley of Silent Men by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 15. For a space he stood where she had left him, staring at the door through which she had gone. The nearness of her in those last few seconds of her presence, the caressing touch of her hands, what he had seen in her eyes, her promise to kiss him if he did not reveal himself, these things, and the thought of the splendid courage that must be inspiring her to face Kedsty now, made him blind even to the door and the wall at which he was apparently looking. He saw only her face as he had seen it in that last moment, her eyes, the tremble of her lips, and the fear which she had not quite hidden from him. She was afraid of Kedsty, he was sure of it. For she had not smiled. There was no flicker of humor in her eyes when she called him Jeems, an intimate use of the names Jim and James in the far north. It was not facetiously that she had promised to kiss him. An almost tragic seriousness had possessed her. And it was that seriousness that thrilled him, that and the amazing frankness with which she had coupled the name Jeems with the promise of her lips. Once before she had called him Jeems. But it was Monsieur Jeems then, and there had been a bit of taunting laughter in her voice. Jim or James meant nothing, but Jeems, he had heard mothers call little children that, in moments of endearment. He knew that wives and sweethearts used it in that same way. For Jim and James were not uncommon names up and down the Three Rivers, even among the half-breeds and French, and Jeems was the closer and the more intimate thing bred of it. His heart was thumping riotously as he went to the door and listened. A little while ago, when she faced him with flashing eyes, commanding him not to question her, he had felt an abyss under his feet. Now he was on a mountain. And he knew that no matter what he heard, unless it was her cry for help, he would not go down. After a little he opened the door a mere crack, so that sound might come to him. She had not forbidden that. Through the crack he could see a dim glow of light in the lower hall. But he heard no sound, and it occurred to him that old Mooie could still run swiftly, and that it might be some time before Kedsty would arrive. As he waited, he looked about the room. His first impression was that Marette must have lived in it for a long time. It was a woman's room, without the newness of sudden and unpremeditated occupancy. He knew that formerly it had been Kedsty's room, but nothing of Kedsty remained in it now. And then, as his wondering eyes beheld the miracle, a number of things struck him with amazing significance. He no longer doubted that Marette Radisson was of the far northland. His faith in that was absolute. If there had been a last question in his mind, it was wiped away because she called him Jeems. Yet this room seemed to give the lie to his faith. Fascinated by his discovery of things, he drew away from the door and stood over the dressing table in front of the mirror. Marette had not prepared the room for him, and her possessions were there. It did not strike him as sacrilege to look at them, the many intimate little things that are mysteriously used in the process of a lady's toilette. It was their number and variety that astounded him. He might have expected them in the boudoir of the Governor-General's daughter at Ottawa, but not here, and much less farther north. What he saw was of exquisite material and workmanship. And then, as if attracted by a magnet, his eyes were drawn to something else. It was a row of shoes, neatly and carefully arranged on the floor at one side of the dressing table. He stared at them, astounded. Never had he seen such an array of feminine footwear intended for the same pair of feet. And it was not northern footwear. Every individual little beauty in that amazing row stood on a high heel. Their variety was something to which he had long been a stranger. There were buttoned boots, laced boots, brown boots, black boots, and white boots, with dangerously high and fragile-looking heels. There were dainty little white kid slippers, slippers with bows, slippers with cut steel buckles, and slippers with dainty ribbon ties. There were high-heeled Oxfords and high-heeled patent leather pumps. He gasped. He reached over, moved by an automatic sort of impulse, and took a satiny little pump in his hand. The size of it gave him a decidedly pleasant mental shock, and beginning to feel like one prying into a sleeper's secrets, he looked inside it. The size was there, number 3, and it had come from Favre's in Montreal. One after another he looked inside half a dozen others, and all of them had come from Favre's in Montreal. The little shoes, more than all else that he had seen or that had happened, sent a question pounding through his brain. Who was Marette Radisson? And that question was followed by other questions until they tumbled over one another in his head. If she was from Montreal, why was she going north? If she belonged in the north, if she was a part of it, why was she taking all of this apparently worthless footwear with her? Why had she come to Athabasca Landing? What was she to Kedsty? Why was she hiding under his roof? Why? He stopped himself, trying to find one answer in all that chaos of questions. It was impossible for him to take his eyes from the shoes. A thought seized him. Ludicrously, he dropped upon his knees in front of the row, and with a face growing hotter each moment, examined them all. But he wanted to know, and the discovery he made was that most of the footwear had been worn, some of it so slightly, however, that the impression of the foot was barely visible. He rose to his feet and continued his inquiry. Of course, she had expected him to look about. One couldn't help seeing unless one were blind. He would have cut off a hand before opening one of the dressing-table drawers. But Marette herself had told him to hide behind the curtains if it became necessary, and it was an excusable caution for him to look behind those curtains now to see what sort of hiding place he had. He returned to the door first and listened. There was still no sound from below. Then he drew the curtains apart as Marette had drawn them. Only he looked longer. He would tell her about it when she returned, if the act needed an apology. His impression was a man's impression. What he saw was a billowing, filmy mass of soft stuff, and out of it there greeted him the faintest possible scent of lilac sachet powder. He closed the curtains with a deep breath of utter joy and of consternation. The two emotions were a jumble to him. The shoes, all that mass of soft stuff behind the curtains, were exquisitely feminine. The breath of perfume had come to him straight out of a woman's soul. There were seduction and witchery to it. He saw Marette, an enrapturing vision of loveliness, floating before his eyes in that sacred and mysterious vestment of which he had stolen a half-frightened glimpse. In white, the white cobwebby thing of laces and embroidery that had hung straight before his eyes, in white, with her glorious black hair, her violet eyes, her— And then it was that the incongruity of the thing, the almost sheer impossibility of it, clashed in upon his vision. Yet his faith was not shaken. Marette Radisson was of the North. He could not disbelieve that, even in the face of these amazing things that confronted him. Suddenly he heard a sound that was like the explosion of a gun under his feet. It was the opening and closing of the hall door, but mostly the closing. The slam of it shook the house and rattled the glass in the windows. Kedsty had returned, and he was in a rage. Kent extinguished the light so that the room was in darkness. Then he went to the door. He could hear the quick, heavy tread of Kedsty's feet. After that came the closing of a second door, followed by the rumble of Kedsty's voice. Kent was disappointed. The inspector of police and Marette were in a room too far distant for him to distinguish what was said. But he knew that Kedsty had returned to barracks and had discovered what had happened there. After an interval his voice was a steady rumble. It rose higher. He heard the crash of a chair. Then the voice ceased, and after it came the tramping of Kedsty's feet. Not once did he catch the sound of Marette's voice, but he was sure that in the interval of silence she was talking. Then Kedsty's voice broke forth more furiously than before. Kent's fingers dug into the sill of the door. Each moment added to his conviction that Marette was in danger. It was not physical violence he feared. He did not believe Kedsty capable of perpetrating that upon a woman. It was fear that he would take her to barracks. The fact that Marette had told him there was a powerful reason why Kedsty would not do this failed to assure him. For she had also told him that Kedsty would kill her if he dared. He held himself in readiness. At a cry from her, or the first move on Kedsty's part to take her from the bungalow, he would give battle in spite of Marette's warning. He almost hoped one of these two things would happen. As he stood there, listening, waiting, the thought became almost a prayer. He had Pelly's revolver. Within 20 seconds he could have Kedsty looking down the barrel of it. The night was ideal for escape. Within half an hour they would be on the river. They could even load up with provisions from Kedsty's place. He opened the door a little more, scarcely making an effort to combat the impulse that dragged him out. Marette must be in danger, or she would not have confessed to him that she was in the house of a man who would like to see her dead. Why she was there did not interest him deeply now. It was the fact of the moment that was moving him swiftly toward action. The door below opened again, and Kent's body grew rigid. He heard Kedsty charging through the lower hall like a mad bull. The outer door opened, slammed shut, and he was gone. Kent drew back into the darkness of his room. It was some moments before he heard Marette coming slowly up the stairs. She seemed to be groping her way, though there was a dim illumination out there. Then she came through the door into the blackness of her room. "Jeems," she whispered. He went to her. Her hand reached out, and again they rested on his arms. You didn't come down the stair?" "No." "You didn't hear?" "I heard no words, only Kedsty's voice." It seemed to him that her voice, when she spoke again, trembled with an immeasurable relief. "You were good, Jeems. I am glad." In that darkness he could not see, yet something reached into him, thrilling him, quickening his pulse with a thing to which his eyes were blind. He bent down. He found her lips upturned, offering him the sweetness of the kiss which was to be his reward. And as he felt their warmth upon his own, he felt also the slightest pressure of her hands upon his arms. "He is gone. We will light the lamp again," she said then. End of chapter 15. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 16 of The Valley of Silent Men. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Valley of Silent Men by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 16. Kent stood still while Marette moved in that gloom, found matches, and lighted the lamp. He had not spoken a word after the kiss. He had not taken advantage of it. The gentle pressure of her hands had restrained him from taking her in his arms. But the kiss itself fired him with a wild and glorious thrill that was like a vibrant music to which every atom of life in his body responded. If he claimed his reward at all, he had expected her kiss to be perhaps indifferent, at least neutral. But the lips she had given him there in the darkness of the room were warm, living, breathing lips. They had not been snatched away from him too quickly. Their sweetness, for an instant, had lingered. Then, in the lamp glow, he was looking into Marette Radisson's face. He knew that his own was aflame. He had no desire to hide its confession, and he was eager to find what lay in her own eyes. And he was astonished, and then startled. The kiss had not disturbed Marette. It was as if it had never happened. She was not embarrassed, and there was no hint of color in her face. It was her deathly whiteness that startled him, a pallor emphasized by the dark masses of her hair and a strange glow in her eyes. It was not a glow brought there by the kiss. It was fear, fading slowly out of them as he looked, until at last it was gone, and her lips trembled with an apologetic smile. "He was very angry," she said. "How easily some men lose their tempers, don't they, Jeems?" The little break in her voice, her brave effort to control herself, and the whimsical bit of smile that accompanied her words, made him want to do what the gentle pressure of her hands had kept him from doing a few moments before, pick her up in his arms. What she was trying to hide he saw plainly. She had been in danger, a danger greater than that which she had quietly and fearlessly faced at barracks. And she was still afraid of that menace. It was the last thing which he wanted him to know, and yet he knew it. A new force swept through him. It was the force which comes of mastery, of possessorship, of fighting grimly against odds. It rose in a mighty triumph. It told him this girl belonged to him, that she was his to fight for. And he was going to fight. Marette saw the change that came into his face. For a moment, after she had spoken, there was silence between them. Outside, the storm beat in a fiercer blast. A roll of thunder crashed over the bungalow. The windows rattled in a sweep of wind and rain. Kent, looking at her, his muscles hardening, his face growing grimmer, nodded toward the window at which Mooie's signal had come. "It is a splendid night for us," he said, "and we must go." She did not answer. "In the eyes of the law I am a murderer," he went on. "You saved me. You shot a man. In those same eyes you are a criminal. It is folly to remain here. It is sheer suicide for both of us. If Kedsty does not do what I told him to do tonight, I shall kill him," she said. The quietness of her words, the steadiness of her eyes, held him speechless. Again it seemed to him, as it had seemed to him in his room at Cardigan's place, that it was a child who was looking at him and speaking to him. If she had shown fear a few moments before, that fear was not revealed in her face now. She was not excited. Her eyes were softly and quietly beautiful. She amazed him and discomfited him. Against that childlike sureness he felt himself helpless. Its potency was greater than his strength, and greater than his determination. It placed between them instantly a vast gulf, a gulf that might be bridged by prayer and entreaty, but never by force. There was no hint of excitement in her threat against Kedsty, and yet in the very calmness of it he felt its deadliness. A whimsical half-smile was trembling on her lips again, and a warmer glow came into her eyes. "Do you know," she said, "that according to an old and sacred code of the North, you belong to me?" "I have heard of that code," he replied. 100 years ago I should have been your slave. If it exists today, I am happy." "Yes, you see the point, Jeems, don't you? You were about to die, probably. I think they would have hanged you. And I saved your life. Therefore your life belongs to me, for I insist that the code still lives. You are my property, and I am going to do with you as I please, until I turn you over to the rivers. And you are not going tonight. You shall wait here for LaSalle and his brigade." "LaSalle? Jean LaSalle?" She nodded. "Yes, that is why you must wait. We have made a splendid arrangement. When LaSalle and his brigade start north, you go with them. And no one will ever know. You are safe here. No one will think of looking for you under the roof of the Inspector of Police." "But you, Marette," he caught himself, remembering her injunction not to question her. Marette shrugged her slim shoulders the slightest bit, and nodded for him to look upon what she knew he had already seen, her room. "It is not uncomfortable," she said. "I have been here for a number of weeks, and nothing has happened to me. I am quite safe. Inspector Kedsty has not looked inside that door since the day your big red-headed friend saw me down in the poplars. He has not put a foot on the stair. That is the deadline. And, I know, you are wondering. You are asking yourself a great many questions. A bon droit, Monsieur Jeems. You are burning up with them. I can see it. And There was something suddenly pathetic about her as she sank into the big-armed, upholstered chair which had been Kedsty's favorite reading chair. She was tired, and for a moment it seemed to Kent that she was almost ready to cry. Her ringers twisted nervously at the shining end of the braid in her lap, and more than ever he thought how slim and helpless she was, yet how gloriously unafraid, how unconquerable with that something within her that burned like the fire of a dynamo. The flame of that force had gone down now, as though the fire itself was dying out, but when she raised her eyes to him, looking up at him from out of the big chair, he knew that back of the yearning, childlike glow that lay in them, the heart of that fire was living and unquenchable. Again, for him, she had ceased to be a woman. It was the soul of a child that lay in her wide-open, wonderfully blue eyes. Twice before he had seen that miracle, and it held him now, as it had held him that first time when she had stood with her back at Cardigan's door. And as it had changed then, so it changed now, slowly, and she was a woman again, with that great gulf of unapproachableness between them. But the yearning was still there, revealing itself to him, and yet, like the sun, infinitely remote from him. "I wish that I might answer those questions for you," she said, in a voice that was low and tired. "I should like to have you know, because I have great faith in you, Jeems. But I cannot. It is impossible. It is inconceivable. If I did—" She made a hopeless little gesture. "If I told you everything, you would not like me any more. And I want you to like me, until you go north with Monsieur Jean and his brigade." "And when I do that," cried Kent, almost savagely, "I shall find this place you call the Valley of Silent Men, if it takes me all my life." It was becoming a joy for him to see the sudden flashes of pleasure that leaped into her eyes. She attempted no concealment. Whatever her emotions were, they revealed themselves unaffectedly, and with a simple freedom from embarrassment that swept him with an almost reverential worship. And what he had just said pleased her. Unreservedly her glowing eyes and her partly smiling lips told him that, and she said, "I am glad you feel that way, Jeems. And I think you would find it in time because," her little trick of looking at him so steadily, as if there was something inside him which she was trying to see more clearly, made him feel more helplessly than ever her slave. It was as if, in those moments, she forgot that he was of flesh and blood, and was looking into his heart to see what was there before she gave voice to things. And then she said, still twisting her braid between her slim fingers, "You would find it, perhaps, because you are one who would not give up easily. Shall I tell you why I came to see you at Dr. Cardigan's? It was curiosity at first, largely that. Just why or how I was interested in the man you freed is one of the things I cannot tell you. And I cannot tell you why I came to the Landing. Nor can I say a word about Kedsty. It may be, some day, that you will know. And then you will not like me. For nearly 4 years before I saw you that day I had been in a desolation. It was a terrible place. I ate my heart and soul out with its ugliness, its loneliness, its emptiness. A little while longer and I would have died. Then the thing happened that brought me away. Can you guess what it was?" He shook his head. "No." "To all the others it was a beautiful place, Montreal." "You were at school there?" he guessed. "Yes, the Villa Maria. I wasn't quite 16 then. They were kind. I think they liked me. But each night I prayed one prayer. You know what the 3 rivers are to us, to the people of the North. The Athabasca is grandmother, the Slave is mother, the McKenzie is daughter, and over them watches always the goddess Niska, the Gray Goose. And my prayer was that I might go back to them. In Montreal there were people everywhere, thousands and tens of thousands of them, so many that I was lonely and heartsick and wanted to get away. For the Gray Goose blood is in me, Jeems. I love the forests. And Niska's god doesn't live in Montreal. Her sun doesn't rise there. Her moon isn't the same there. The flowers are not hers. The winds tell different stories. The air is another air. People, when they look at you, look in another way. Away down the 3 rivers I had loved men. There I was learning to hate them. Then something happened. I came to Athabasca Landing. I went to see you because—" She clasped her 2 hands tightly in her lap. "Because, after those 4 terrible years, you were the first man I found who was playing a great, big, square game to the end. Don't ask me how I found it out. Please don't ask me anything. I am telling you all you can know, all you shall know. But I did find it out. And then I learned that you were not going to die. Kedsty told me that. And when I had talked with you I knew that you would play any game square, and I made up my mind to help you. That is why I am telling you all this, just to let you know that I have faith in you, and that you must not break that faith. You must not insist on knowing more about me. You must still play the game. I am playing mine, and you must play yours. And to play yours clean, you must go with Laselle's brigade and leave me with Kedsty. You must forget what has happened. You must forget what may happen. You cannot help me. You can only harm me. And if, some day, a long time from now, you should happen to find the Valley of Silent Men—" He waited, his heart pounding like a fist. "I may—be there," she finished, in a voice so low that it was scarcely above a whisper. It seemed to him that she was looking a long way off, and it was not in his direction. And then she smiled, not at him, but in a half-hopeless little way. "I think I shall be disappointed if you don't find it," she said then, and her eyes were pure as the blue flowers from which they had stolen their color as she looked at him. "You know the great sulphur country beyond Fort Simpson, westward between the two Nahannis?" "Yes, that is where Kilbane and his patrol were lost. The Indians call it the Devil Country. Is that it?" She nodded. "They say no living thing has ever been through the sulphur country," she said. "But that is not true. I have been through it. It is beyond the sulphur country you must go to find the Valley of Silent Men, straight through that gap between the North and the South Nahanni. That is the way you must go if you should ever find it, Jeems, for otherwise you would have to come down from Dawson or go up from Skagway, and the country is so great that you would never come upon it in 1,000 years. The police will not find you there. You will always be safe. Perhaps I shall tell you more before the brigade comes. But that is all tonight. I may never tell you anything more, and you must not question me." Speechless he had stood, all the life of his soul burning like a fire in his eyes, as he looked at her and listened to her, and now, quietly and unexcitedly, he said, "Marette, I am going to play this game as you want me to play it, because I love you. It is only honest for me to tell you in words what you must already know. And I am going to fight for you as long as there is a drop of blood in my body. If I go with Jean Laselle's brigade, will you promise me—" His voice trembled. He was repressing a mighty emotion. But not by the quiver of one of her long lashes did Marette Radisson give evidence that she had even heard his confession of love. She interrupted him before he had finished. "I can promise you nothing, no matter what you do." "Jeems, Jeems, you are not like those other men I learned to hate. You will not insist? If you do, if you are like them, yes, you may go away from here tonight and not wait for Jean Lasalle. Listen, the storm will not break for hours. If you are going to demand a price for playing the game as I want you to play it, you may go. You have my permission." She was very white. She rose from the big chair and stood before him. There was no anger in her voice or gesture, but her eyes glowed like luminous stars. There was something in them which he had not seen before, and suddenly a thought struck his heart cold as ice. With a low cry he stretched out his hands. "My God, Marette, I am not a murderer. I did not kill John Barkley." She did not answer him. "You don't believe me," he cried. "You believe that I killed Barkley, and that now, a murderer, I dare to tell you that I love you." She was trembling. It was like a little shiver running through her. For only a flash it seemed to him that he had caught a glimpse of something terrible, a thing she was hiding, a thing she was fighting as she stood there with her two little clenched hands. For in her face, in her eyes, in the beating throb of her white throat, he saw in that moment the almost hidden agony of a hurt thing. And then it was gone, even as he entreated again, pleading for her faith. "I did not kill John Barkley." "I am not thinking of that, Jeems," she said. "It is of something—" They had forgotten the storm. It was howling and beating at the windows outside. But suddenly there came a sound that rose above the monotonous tumult of it, and Marette started, as if it had sent an electric shock through her. Kent, too, turned toward the window. It was the metallic tap, tap, tapping which once before had warned them of approaching danger. And this time it was insistent. It was as if a voice was crying out to them from beyond the window. It was more than premonition. It was the alarm of a near and impending menace. And in that moment Kent saw Marette Radisson's hands go swiftly to her throat, and her eyes leap with sudden fire, and she gave a little cry as she listened to the sound. End of chapter 16. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 17 of The Valley of Silent Men. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Valley of Silent Men by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 17. In 10 seconds, it seemed to Kent, Marette Radisson was again the splendid creature who had held the 3 men at bay over the end of her little black gun at barracks. The sound of Mooie's second warning came at first as a shock. Accompanying it, there was a moment of fear driven almost to the point of actual terror. Following it came a reaction so swift that Kent was dazed. Within those 10 seconds, the girl's slender body seemed to grow taller. A new light flamed in her face. Her eyes, turning swiftly to him, were filled with the same fire with which they had faced the 3 constables. She was unafraid. She was ready to fight. In such moments as these, it was the quiet and dispassionate composure of her voice that amazed him most. It was musical in its softness now. Yet in that softness was a hidden thing. It was like velvet covering steel. She had spoken of Niska, the gray goose, the goddess of the 3 rivers. And he thought that something of the spirit of a goddess must be in Marette Radisson to give her the courage with which she faced him, even as the metallic thing outside tapped its warning again at the window. "Inspector Kedsty is coming back," she said. "I did not think he would do that tonight." "He has not had time to go to barracks," said Kent. "No. Possibly he has forgotten something. Before he arrives, I want to show you the nest I have made for you, Jeems. Come quickly." It was her first intimation that he was not to remain in her room, a possibility that had already caused him some inward embarrassment. She seized a number of matches, turned down her light, and hurried into the hall. Kent followed her to the end of this hall, where she paused before a low, half door that apparently opened into some sort of a space close under the sloping roof of the bungalow. "It is an old storeroom," she whispered. "I have made it quite comfortable, I think. I have covered the window, so you may light the lamp. But you must see that no light shows under this door. Lock it on the inside, and be very quiet. For whatever you find in there you must thank M'sieu Fingers." She pulled the door slightly open and gave him the matches. The illumination in the lower hall made its way only dimly to where they stood. In the gloom he found himself close to the soft glow of her eyes. His fingers closed about her hand as he took the matches. "Marette, you believe me?" he entreated. "You believe that I love you, and that I didn't kill John Barkley, that I am going to fight for you as long as God gives me breath to fight?" For a moment there was silence. Her hand withdrew gently from his. "Yes, I think that I believe. Good night, Jeems." She went from him quickly. At her door she turned. "Go in now, please," she called back softly. "If you care as you say you do, go in." She did not wait for his reply. Her own door closed behind her, and Kent, striking a match, stooped low and entered his hiding place. In a moment he saw directly ahead of him a lamp on a box. He lighted this, and his first movement then was to close the door and turn the key that was in the lock. After that he looked about him. The storeroom was not more than 10 feet square, and the roof was so close over his head that he could not stand upright. It was not the smallness of the place that struck him first, but the preparations which Marette had made for him. In a corner was a bed of blankets, and the rough floor of the place was carpeted with blankets, except for a 2 or 3 foot space around the edge of it. Beyond the box was a table and a chair, and it was the burden of this table that made his pulse jump quickest. Marette had not forgotten that he might grow hungry. It was laid sumptuously, with a plate for one, but with food for half a dozen. There were a brace of roasted grouse, brown as nuts, a cold roast of moose meat or beef, a dish piled high with golden potato salad, olives, pickles, an open can of cherries, a loaf of bread, butter, cheese, and one of Kedsty's treasured thermos bottles, which undoubtedly held hot coffee or tea. And then he noticed what was on the chair: a belt and holster and a Colt automatic .45. Marette had not figured on securing a gun in the affair at barracks, and her foresight had not forgotten a weapon. She had placed it conspicuously where he could not fail to see it at once. And just beyond the chair, on the floor, was a shoulder pack. It was of the regulation service sort, partly filled. Resting against the pack was a Winchester. He recognized the gun. He had seen it hanging in Dirty Fingers' shack. For a matter of 5 minutes he scarcely moved from where he stood beside the table. Nothing but an unplastered roof was between him and the storm, and over his head the thunder crashed and the rain beat in torrents. He saw where the window was, carefully covered with a blanket. Even through the blanket he caught faintly the illumination of lightning. This window overlooked the entrance to Kedsty's bungalow, and the idea came to him of turning out the light and opening it. In darkness he took down the blanket. But the window itself was not movable, and after assuring himself of this fact, he flattened his face against it, peering out into the chaos of the night. In that instant came a flare of lightning, and to Kent, looking down, was revealed a sight that tightened every muscle in his body. More vividly than if it had been day, he saw a man standing below in the deluge. It was not Mooie. It was not Kedsty. It was no one that he had ever seen. Even more like a ghost than a man was that apparition of the lightning flare. A great, gaunt giant of a ghost, bare-headed, with long, dripping hair and a long, storm-twisted beard. The picture shot to his brain with the swiftness of the lightning itself. It was like the sudden throwing of a cinema picture on a screen. Then blackness shut it out. Kent stared harder. He waited. Again came the lightning, and again he saw that tragic, ghost-like figure waiting in the storm. 3 times he saw it, and he knew that the mysterious bearded giant was an old man. The 4th time the lightning came, the figure was gone. And in that flare it was the bowed figure of Kedsty he saw hurrying up the gravel path to the door. Quickly Kent covered the window, but he did not relight the lamp. Before Kedsty could have reached the foot of the stair, he had unlocked the door. Cautiously he opened it 3 or 4 inches and sat down with his back against the wall, listening. He heard Kedsty pass through into the big room where Marette had waited for him a short time before. After that there was silence, except for the tumult of the storm. For an hour Kent listened. In all that time he did not hear a sound from the lower hall or from Marette's room. He wondered if she was sleeping, and if Kedsty had gone to bed, waiting for morning before he set in action his bloodhounds of the law. Kent had no intention of disturbing the comfortable-looking bed of blankets. He was not only sleepless, but filled with a premonition of events about to happen. He felt impinging itself more and more upon him a sense of watchfulness. That Inspector Kedsty and Marette Radisson were under the same roof, and that there was some potent and mysterious reason which kept Kedsty from betraying the girl's presence was the thought which troubled him most. He was not developing further the plans for his own escape. He was thinking of Marette. What was her power over Kedsty? Why was it that Kedsty would like to see her dead? Why was she in his house? Again and again he asked himself the questions and found no answers to them. And yet, even in this purgatory of mystery that environed him, he felt himself happier than he had ever been in his life. For Marette was not 400 or 500 miles down the river. She was in the same house with him, and he had told her that he loved her. He was glad that he had been given courage to let her know that. He relighted the lamp, and opened his watch and placed it on the table, where frequently he could look at the time. He wanted to smoke his pipe, but the odor of tobacco, he was sure, would reach Kedsty, unless the Inspector had actually retired into his bedroom for the night. Half a dozen times he questioned himself as to the identity of the ghostly apparition he had seen in the lightning flare of the storm. Perhaps it was some one of Fingers' strange friends from out of the wilderness, Mooie's partner in watching the bungalow. The picture of that giant of a man with his great beard and long hair, as his eyes had caught him in a sea of electrical fire, was indelibly burned into his brain. It was a tragic picture. Again he put out the light and bared the blanketed window, but he saw nothing but the sodden gleam of the earth when the lightning flashed. A second time he opened the door a few inches and sat down with his back to the wall, listening. How long it was before drowsiness stole upon him he did not know, but it came, and for a few moments at a time, as his eyes closed, it robbed him of his caution. And then, for a space, he slept. A sound brought him suddenly into wide wakefulness. His first impression was that the sound had been a cry. For a moment or two, as his senses adjusted themselves, he was not sure. Then, swiftly, the thing grew upon him. He rose to his feet and widened the crack of his door. A bar of light shot across the upper hall. It was from Marette's room. He had taken off his boots to deaden the sound of his feet, and he stepped outside his door. He was positive he heard a low cry, a choking, sobbing cry, only barely audible, and that it came from down the stair. No longer hesitating, he moved quickly to Marette's room and looked in. His first glimpse was of the bed. It had not been used. The room was empty. Something cold and chilling gripped at his heart, and an impulse which he no longer made an effort to resist pulled him to the head of the stair. It was more than an impulse. It was a demand. Step by step he went down, his hand on the butt of his Colt. He reached the lower hall, which was still lighted, and a step or two brought him to a view of the door that opened into the big living room beyond. That door was partly open, and the room itself was filled with light. Soundlessly Kent approached. He looked in. What he saw first brought him relief together with shock. At one end of the long desk table over which hung a great brass lamp stood Marette. She was in profile to him. He could not see her face. Her hair fell loose about her, glowing like a rich sable cape in the light of the lamp. She was safe, alive, and yet the attitude of her as she looked down was the thing that gave him shock. He was compelled to move a few inches more before he could see what she was staring at. And then his heart stopped dead still. Huddled down in his chair, with his head flung back so that the terrible ghastliness of his face fronted Kent, was Kedsty. And Kent, in an instant, knew. Only a dead man could look like that. With a cry he entered the room. Marette did not start, but an answering cry came into her throat as she turned her eyes from Kedsty to him. To Kent it was like looking upon the dead in two ways. Marette Radisson, living and breathing, was whiter than Kedsty, who was white with the unbreathing pallor of the actually dead. She did not speak. She made no sound after that answering cry in her throat. She simply looked. And Kent spoke her name gently as he saw her great, wide eyes blading dully their agony and despair. Then, like one stunned and fascinated, she stared down upon Kedsty again. Every instinct of the man-hunter came alive in Kent's brain as he, too, turned toward the Inspector of Police. Kedsty's arms hung limp over the side of his chair. On the floor under his right hand was his Colt automatic. His head was strained so far over the back of the chair that it looked as though his neck had been broken. On his forehead, close up against his short-cropped iron-gray hair, was a red stain. Kent approached and bent over him. He had seen death too many times not to recognize it now, but seldom had he seen a face twisted and distorted as Kedsty's was. His eyes were open and bulging in a glassy stare. His jaws hung loose. It was then that Kent's blood froze in his veins. Kedsty had received a blow, but it was not the blow that had killed him. Afterward he had been choked to death. And the thing that had choked him was a tress of woman's hair. In the seconds that followed that discovery, Kent could not have moved if his own life had paid the penalty of inaction. For the story was told, there about Kedsty's throat and on his chest. The tress of hair was long and soft and shining and black. It was twisted twice around Kedsty's neck, and the loose end rippled down over his shoulder, glowing like a bit of rich sable in the lamplight. It was that thought of velvety sable that had come to him at the doorway, looking at Marette. It was the thought that came to him now. He touched it. He took it in his fingers. He unwound it from about Kedsty's neck, where it had made two deep rings in the flesh. From his fingers it rippled out full length. And he turned slowly and faced Marette Radisson. Never had human eyes looked at him as she was looking at him now. She reached out a hand, her lips mute, and Kent gave her the tress of hair. And the next instant she turned, with a hand clasped at her own throat, and passed through the door. After that he heard her going unsteadily up the stairs. End of chapter 17. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 18 of The Valley of Silent Men. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Valley of Silent Men by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 18. Kent did not move. His senses for a space were stunned. He was almost physically insensible to all emotions but that one of shock and horror. He was staring at Kedsty's gray-white, twisted face when he heard Marette's door close. A cry came from his lips, but he did not hear it, was unconscious that he had made a sound. His body shook with a sudden tremor. He could not disbelieve, for the evidence was there. From behind, as he had sat in his chair, Marette Radisson had struck the Inspector of Police with some blunt object. The blow had stunned him, and after that he drew a hand across his eyes as if to clear his vision. What he had seen was impossible. The evidence was impossible. Assaulted, in deadly peril, defending either honor or love, Marette Radisson was of the blood to kill. But to creep up behind her victim, it was inconceivable. Yet there had been no struggle. Even the automatic on the floor gave no evidence of that. Kent picked it up. He looked at it closely, and again the unconscious cry of despair came in a half groan from his lips. For on the butt of the Colt was a stain of blood and a few gray hairs. Kedsty had been stunned by a blow from his own gun. As Kent placed it on the table, his eyes caught suddenly a gleam of steel under the edge of a newspaper, and he drew out from their hiding place the long-bladed clipping scissors which Kedsty had used in the preparation of his scrapbooks and official reports. It was the last link in the deadly evidence, the automatic with its telltale stain, the scissors, the tress of hair, and Marette Radisson. He felt a sensation of sudden dizziness. Every nerve center in his body had received its shock, and when the shock had passed it left him sweating. Swiftly the reaction came. It was a lie, he told himself. The evidence was false. Marette could not have committed that crime, as the crime had visualized itself before his eyes. There was something which he had not seen, something which he could not see, something that was hiding itself from him. He became in an instant the old James Kent. The instinctive processes of the man-hunter leaped to their stations like trained soldiers. He saw Marette again as she had looked at him when he entered the room. It was not murder he had caught in her wide-open eyes. It was not hatred. It was not madness. It was a quivering, bleeding soul crying out to him in an agony that no other human eyes had ever revealed to him before. And suddenly a great voice cried out in his brain, drowning all other things, telling him how contemptible a thing was love unless in that love was faith. With his heart choking him, he turned again to Kedsty. The futility of the thing which he had told himself was faith gripped at him sickeningly, yet he fought for that faith, even as his eyes looked again upon the ghastly torture that was in Kedsty's face. He was becoming calmer. He touched the dead man's cheek and found that it was no longer warm. The tragedy must have occurred an hour before. He examined more closely the abrasion on Kedsty's forehead. It was not a deep wound, and the blow that had made it must have stunned the inspector of police for only a short time. In that space the other thing had happened. In spite of his almost superhuman effort to keep the picture away from him, Kent saw it vividly, the swift turning to the table, the inspiration of the scissors, the clipping of the long tress of hair, the choking to death of Kedsty as he regained consciousness. Over and over again he whispered to himself the impossibility of it, the absurdity of it, the utter incongruity of it. Only a brain gone mad would have conceived that monstrous way of killing Kedsty. And Marette was not mad. She was sane. Like the eyes of a hunting ferret, his own eyes swept quickly about the room. At the four windows there were long curtain cords. On the walls, hung there as trophies, were a number of weapons. On one end of Kedsty's desk, used as a paperweight, was a stone tomahawk. Still nearer to the dead man's hands, unhidden by papers, was a bootlace. Under his limp right hand was the automatic. With these possible instruments of death close at hand, ready to be snatched up without trouble or waste of time, why had the murderer used a tress of woman's hair? The bootlace drew Kent's eyes. It was impossible not to see it, 48 inches long and quarter-inch wide buckskin. He began seeking for its mate, and found it on the floor where Marette Radisson had been standing. And again the unanswerable question pounded in Kent's brain. Why had Kedsty's murderer used a tress of hair instead of a buckskin lace or one of the curtain cords hanging conspicuously at the windows? He went to each of these windows and found them locked. Then, a last time, he bent over Kedsty. He knew that in the final moments of his life Kedsty had suffered a slow and torturing agony. His twisted face left the story. And the inspector of police was a powerful man. He had struggled, still partly dazed by the blow. But it had taken strength to overcome him even then, to hold his head back, to choke life out of him slowly with the noose of hair. And Kent, now that the significance of what he saw began to grow upon him more clearly, felt triumphing over all other things in his soul a slow and mighty joy. It was inconceivable that with the strength of her own hands and body Marette Radisson had killed Kedsty. A greater strength than hers had held him in the death chair, and a greater strength than hers had choked life from the inspector of police. He drew slowly out of the room, closing the door noiselessly behind him. He found that the front door was as Kedsty had left it, unlocked. Close to that door he stood for a space, scarcely allowing himself to breathe. He listened, but no sound came down the dimly illuminated stairway. A new thing was pressing upon him now. It rode over the shock of tragedy, over the first roused instincts of the man-hunter, overwhelming him with the realization of a horror such as had never confronted him before. It gripped him more fiercely than the mere killing of Kedsty. His thought was of Marette, of the fate which dawn and discovery would bring for her. His hands clenched and his jaws tightened. The world was against him, and tomorrow it would be against her. Only he, in the face of all that condemning evidence in the room beyond, would disbelieve her guilty of Kedsty's death. And he, Jim Kent, was already a murderer in the eyes of the law. He felt within him the slow growing inspiration of a new spirit, the gathering might of a new force. A few hours ago he was an outcast. He was condemned. Life, for him, had been robbed of its last hope. And in that hour of his grimmest despair, Marette Radisson had come to him. Through storm that had rocked the earth under her feet and set ablaze the chaotic blackness of the sky over her head, she had struggled for him. She had counted no cost. She had measured no chances. She had simply come because she believed in him. And now, upstairs, she was the victim of the terrible price that was the first cost of his freedom. For he believed, now that the thought came to him like a dagger stroke, that this was so. Her act in freeing him had brought about the final climax, and as a result of it, Kedsty was dead. He went to the foot of the stair. Quietly, in his shoeless feet, he began to climb them. He wanted to cry out Marette's name even before he came to the top. He wanted to reach up to her with his arms outstretched. But he came silently to her door and looked in. She lay in a crumpled, huddled heap on her bed. Her face was hidden, and all about her lay her smothering hair. For a moment he was frightened. He could not see that she was breathing. So still was she that she was like one dead. His footsteps were unheard as he moved across the room. He knelt down beside her, reached out his arms, and gathered her into them. "Marette!" he cried in a low voice. He felt the sudden quiver, like a little shock, that ran through her. He crushed his face down so that it lay in her hair, still damp from its wetting. He drew her closer, tightening his arms about her slender body, and a little cry came from her, a cry that was a broken thing, a sob without tears. "Marette!" It was all he said. It was all he could say in that moment when his heart was beating like a drum against her breast. And then he felt the slow pressure of her hands against him, saw her white face, her wide, staring eyes within a few inches of his own, and she drew away from him, back against the wall, still huddled like a child on the bed, with her eyes fixed on him in a way that frightened him. There were no tears in them. She had not been crying. But her face was as white as he had seen it down in Kedsty's room. Some of the horror and shock had gone out of it. In it was another look as her eyes glowed upon Kent. It was a look of incredulity, of disbelief, a thing slowly fading away under the miracle of an amazing revelation. The truth thrust itself upon him. Marette had not expected that he would come to her like this. She had believed that he would take flight into the night, escaping from her as he would have run from a plague. She put up her two hands, in the trick they had of groping at her white throat, and her lips formed a word which she did not speak. Kent, to his own amazement, was smiling and still on his knees. He pulled himself to his feet and stood up straight, looking down at her in that same strange, comforting, all-powerful way. The thrill of it was passing into her veins. A flush of color was driving the deathly pallor from her face. Her lips were parted, and she breathed quickly, a little excitedly. "I thought you would go," she said. "Not without you," he said. "I have come to take you with me." He drew out his watch. It was 2:00. He held it down so that she could look at the dial. "If the storm keeps up, we have 3 hours before dawn," he said. "How soon can you be ready, Marette?" He was fighting to make his voice quiet and unexcited. It was a terrific struggle. And Marette was not blind to it. She drew herself from the bed and stood up before him, her two hands still clasped at her throbbing throat. "You believe that I killed Kedsty," she said in a voice that was forced from her lips. "And you have come to help me, to pay me for what I tried to do for you? That is it, Jeems?" "Pay you?" he cried. "I couldn't pay you in a million years. From that day you first came to Cardigan's place you gave me life. You came when the last spark of hope in me had died. I shall always believe that I would have died that night. But you saved me. From the moment I saw you, I loved you, and I believe it was that love that kept me alive. And then you came to me again, down there, through this storm. Pay you? I can't. I never shall be able to. Because you thought I had killed a man made no difference. You came just the same, and you came ready to kill, if necessary, for me. I'm not trying to tell myself why, but you did. You are ready to kill, and I am ready to kill, tonight, for you. I haven't got time to think about Kedsty. I'm thinking about you. If you killed him, I'm just telling myself there was a mighty good reason for it. But I don't believe it was you who killed him. You couldn't do it, with those hands." He reached out suddenly and seized them, slipping his grip to her wrists so that her hands lay upward in his own, hands that were small, slim-fingered, soft-palmed, beautiful. "They couldn't!" he cried, almost fiercely. "I swear to God they couldn't!" Her eyes and face flamed at his words. "You believe that, Jeems?" "Yes, just as you believe that I did not kill John Barkley. But the world is against us. It is against us both now, and we've got to hunt that hidden valley of yours together. Understand, Marette? And I'm rather glad." He turned toward the door. "Will you be ready in 10 minutes?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, in 10 minutes." He ran out into the hall and down the stair, locking the front door. Then he returned to his hiding place under the roof. He knew that a strange sort of madness was in his blood, for in the face of tonight's tragedy Only madness could inspire him with the ecstatic thrill that was in his veins. Kedsty's death seemed far removed from a more important thing, the fact that from this hour Marette was his to fight for, that she belonged to him, that she must go with him. He loved her. In spite of whoever she was and whatever she had done, he loved her. Very soon she would tell him what had happened in the room below, and the thing would be clear. There was one little corner of his brain that fought him. It kept telling him, like a parrot, that it was a tress of Marette's hair about Kedsty's throat, and that it was the hair that had choked him. But Marette would explain that too. He was sure of it. In the face of the facts below he was illogical and unreasonable. He knew it. But his love for this girl, who had come strangely and tragically into his life, was like an intoxicant. And his faith was illimitable. She did not kill Kedsty. Another part of his brain kept repeating that over and over, even as he recalled that only a few hours before she had told him quite calmly that she would kill the inspector of police, if a certain thing should happen. His hands worked as swiftly as his thoughts. He laced up his service boots. All the food and dishes on the table he made into a compact bundle and placed in the shoulder pack. He carried this and the rifle out into the hall. Then he returned to Marette's room. The door was closed. At his knock the girl's voice told him that she was not quite ready. He waited. He could hear her moving about quickly in her room. An interval of silence followed. Another 5 minutes passed. 10. 15. He tapped at the door again. This time it was opened. He stared, amazed at the change in Marette. She had stepped back from the door to let him enter, and stood full in the lamp glow. Her slim, beautiful body was dressed in a velvety blue corduroy. The coat was close-fitting and boyish. The skirt came only a little below her knees. On her feet were high-topped caribou boots. About her waist was a holster and the little black gun. Her hair was done up and crowded under a close-fitting turban. She was exquisitely lovely as she stood there waiting for him, and in that loveliness Kent saw there was not one thing out of place. The corduroy, the turban, the short skirt, and the high, laced boots were made for the wilderness. She was not a tenderfoot. She was a little sourdough, clear through. Gladness leaped into Kent's face. But it was not the transformation of her dress alone that amazed him. She was changed in another way. Her cheeks were flushed. Her eyes glowed with a strange and wonderful radiance as she looked at him. Her lips were red, as he had seen them that first time at Cardigan's place. Her pallor, her fear, her horror were gone, and in their place was the repressed excitement of one about to enter upon a strange adventure. On the floor was a pack only half as large as Kent's, and when he picked it up he found it of almost no weight. He fastened it to his own pack, while Marette put on her raincoat and went down the stair ahead of him. In the hall below she was waiting, when he came down, with Kedsty's big rubber slicker in her hands. "You must put it on," she said. She shuddered slightly as she held the garment. The color was almost gone from her cheeks as she faced the door beyond which the dead man sat in his chair, but the marvelous glow was still in her eyes as she helped Kent with his pack and the slicker, and afterward stood for an instant with her hands touching his breast, and her lips as if about to speak something which she held back. A few steps beyond them they heard the storm. It seemed to rush upon the bungalow in a new fury, beating at the door, crashing over their heads in thunder, daring them to come out. Kent reached up and turned out the hall light. In darkness he opened the door. Rain and wind swept in. With his free hand he groped out, found Marette, drew her after him, and closed the door again. Entering from the lighted hall into the storm was like being swallowed in a pit of blackness. It engulfed and smothered them. Then came suddenly a flash of lightning, and he saw Marette's face, white and drenched, but looking at him with that same strange glow in her eyes. It thrilled him. Even in the darkness it was there. It had been there since he had returned to her from Kedsty and had knelt at her bedside, with his arms about her for a moment. Only now, in the beat of the storm, did an answer to the miracle of it come to him. It was because of him. It was because of his faith in her. Even death and horror could not keep it from her eyes. He wanted to cry out the joy of his discovery, to give wild voice to it in the teeth of the wind and the rain. He felt sweeping through him a force mightier than that of the night. Her hands were on his arm, as if she was afraid of losing him in that pit of blackness. The soft cling of them was like a contact through which came a warm thrill of electrical life. He put out his arm and drew her to him, so that for a moment his face pressed against the top of her wet little turban. And then he heard her say, "There is a scow at the bayou, Jeems. It is close to the end of the path. M'sieu Fingers has kept it there, waiting, ready." He had been thinking of Crossen's place and an open boat. He blessed Fingers again as he took Marette's hand in his own and started for the trail that led through the poplar thicket. Their feet slopped deep in wet and mud, and with the rain there was a wind that took their breath away. It was impossible to see a tree an arm's length away, and Kent hoped that the lightning would come frequently enough to guide him. In the first flare of it he looked down the slope that led riverward. Little rivulets of water were running down it. Rocks and stumps were in their way, and underfoot it was slippery. Marette's fingers were clinging to his again, as she had held to them on the wild race up to Kedsty's bungalow from the barracks. He had tingled then in the sheer joy of their thrill, but it was a different thrill that stirred him now, an overwhelming emotion of possessorship. This night, with its storm and its blackness, was the most wonderful of all his nights. He sensed nothing of its discomfort. It could not beat back the joyous racing of his blood in his body. Sun and stars, day and night, sunshine and cloud, were trivial and inconsequential to him now. For close to him, struggling with him, fighting through the night with him, trusting him, helpless without him, was the living, breathing thing he loved more than he loved his own life. For many years, without knowing it, he had waited for this night, and now it was upon him. It inundated and swept away his old life. He was no longer the huntsman, but the hunted. He was no longer alone, but had a priceless thing to fight for, a priceless and helpless thing that was clinging to his fingers in the darkness. He did not feel like a fugitive, but as one who has come into a great triumph. He sensed no uncertainty or doubt. The river lay ahead, and for him the river had become the soul and the promise of life. It was Marette's river and his river, and in a little while they would be on it. And Marette would then tell him about Kedsty. He was sure of that. She would tell him what had happened while he slept. His faith was illimitable. They came into the sodden dip at the foot of the ridge, and the lightning revealed to him the edge of the poplar growth in which O'Connor had seen Marette many weeks ago. The bayou trail wound through this, and Kent struck out for it blindly in the darkness. He did not try to talk, but he freed his companion's hand and put his arm about her when they came to the level ground, so that she was sheltered by him from the beat of the storm. Then brush swished in their faces, and they stopped, waiting for the lightning again. Kent was not anxious for it to come. He drew the girl still closer, and in that pit of blackness, with the deluge about her and the crash of thunder over her head, she snuggled up against his breast, the throb of her body against him, waiting, watching with him. Her frailty, the helplessness of her, the slimness of her in the crook of his arm, filled him with an exquisite exultation. He did not think of her now as the splendid, fearless creature who had leveled her little black gun at the three men in barracks. She was no longer the mysterious, defiant, unafraid person who had held him in a sort of awe that first hour in Kedsty's place. For she was crumpled against him now, utterly dependent and afraid. In that chaos of storm something told him that her nerve was broken, that without him she would be lost and would cry out in fear. And he was glad. He held her tighter. He bent his head until his face touched the wet, crushed hair under the edge of her turban. And then the lightning split open the night again, and he saw the way ahead of him to the trail. Even in darkness it was not difficult to follow in the clean-cut wagon path. Over their heads the tops of the poplars swished and wailed. Under their feet the roadway in places was a running stream, or inundated until it became a pool. In pitch blackness they struck such a pool, and in spite of the handicap of his packs and rifle, Kent stopped suddenly, and picked Marette up in his arms and carried her until they reached high ground. He did not ask permission. And Marette, for a minute or two, lay crumpled up close in his arms, and for a thrilling instant his face touched her rain-wet cheek. The miracle of their adventure was that neither spoke. To Kent the silence between them had become a thing which he had no desire to break. In that silence, excused and abetted by the tumult of the storm, he felt that a wonderful something was drawing them closer and closer together, and that words might spoil the indescribable magic of the thing that was happening. When he set Marette on her feet again, her hand accidentally fell upon his, and for a moment her fingers closed upon it in a soft pressure that meant more to him than 1,000 words of gratitude. A quarter of a mile beyond the poplar thicket they came to the edge of the spruce and cedar timber, and soon the thick walls of the forest shut them in, sheltering them from the wind. But the blackness was even more like that of a bottomless pit. Kent had noticed that the thunder and lightning were drifting steadily eastward, and now the occasional flashes of electrical fire scarcely illumined the track ahead of them. The rain was not beating so fiercely. They could hear the wail of the spruce and cedar tops, and the slush of their boots in mud and water. An interval came, where the spruce tops met overhead, when it was almost calm. It was then that Kent threw out of him a great deep breath and laughed joyously and exultantly. "Are you wet, little Gray Goose?" "Only outside, Big Otter. My feathers have kept me dry." Her voice had a trembling, half-sobbing, half-rejoicing note in it. It was not the voice of one who had recently killed a man. In it was a pathos which Kent knew she was trying to hide behind brave words. Her hands clung to the arm of his rubber slicker even as they stood there, close together, as if she was afraid something might drag them apart in that treacherous gloom. Kent, fumbling for a moment, drew from an inner pocket a dry handkerchief. Then he found her face, tilted it a bit upward, and wiped it dry. He might have done the same thing to a child who had been crying. After that he scrubbed his own, and they went on, his arm about her again. It was 1/2 mile from the edge of the forest to the bayou, and 1/2 times in that distance Kent took the girl in his arms and carried her through water that almost reached his boot tops. The lightning no longer served them. The rain still fell steadily, but the wind had gone with the eastward sweep of the storm. Close hung with the forest walls, the bayou itself was indiscernible in the blackness. Marette guided him now, though Kent walked ahead of her, holding firmly to her hand. Unless fingers had changed its location, the scow should be somewhere within 40 or 50 paces of the end of the trail. It was small, a 2-man scow, with a tight little house built amidships. And it was tied close up against the shore. Marette told him this, as they felt their way through brush and reeds. Then he stumbled against something taut and knee-high, and he found it was the tie rope. Leaving Marette with her back to the anchor tree, he went aboard. The water was 3 or 4 inches deep in the bottom of the scow, but the cabin was built on a platform raised above the floor of the boat, and Kent hoped it was still dry. He groped until he found the twisted wire which held the door shut. Opening it, he ducked his head low and entered. The little room was not more than 4 feet high, and for greater convenience he fell upon his knees while fumbling under his slicker for his waterproof box of matches. The water had not yet risen above the floor. The first light he struck revealed the interior to him. It was a tiny cabin, scarcely larger than some boxes he had seen. It was about 8 feet long by 6 in width, and the ceiling was so low that, even kneeling, his head touched it. His match burned out, and he lighted another. This time he saw a candle stuck in a bit of split birch that projected from the wall. He crept to it and lighted it. For a moment he looked about him, and again he blessed Fingers. The little scow was prepared for a voyage. 2 narrow bunks were built at the far end, one so close above the other that Kent grinned as he thought of squeezing between. There were blankets. Within reach of his arm was a tiny stove, and close to the stove a supply of kindling and dry wood. The whole thing made him think of a child's playhouse. Yet there was still room for a wide, comfortable, cane-bottomed chair, a stool, and a smooth-planed board fastened under a window, so that it answered the purpose of a table. This table was piled with many packages. He stripped off his packs and returned for Marette. She had come to the edge of the scow, and called to him softly as she heard him splashing through the water. Her arms were reaching toward him to meet him in the darkness. He carried her through the shallow sea about his feet, and laughed as he put her down on the edge of the platform at the door. It was a low, joyous laugh. The yellow light of the candles sputtered in their wet faces. Only dimly could he see her, but her eyes were shining. "Your nest, little Gray Goose," he cried gently. Her hand reached up and touched his face. "You have been good to me, Jeems," she said, a little tremble in her voice. "You may kiss me." Out in the beat of the rain, Kent's heart choked him with song. His soul swelled with the desire to shout forth a paean of joy and triumph at the world he was leaving this night for all time. With the warm thrill of Marette's lips he had become the Superman, and as he leaped ashore in the darkness and cut the tie rope with a single slash of his knife, he wanted to give voice to the thing that was in him as the rivermen had chanted in the glory of their freedom the day the big brigade started north. And he did sing, under his laughing, sobbing breath. With a giant's strength he sent the scow out into the bayou, and then back and forth he swung the long one-man sweep, twisting the craft riverward with the force of two pairs of arms instead of one. Behind the closed door of the tiny cabin was all that the world now held worth fighting for. By turning his head, he could see the faint illumination of the candle at the window. The light. The cabin. Marette. He laughed inanely, foolishly, like a boy. He began to hear a dull, droning murmur, a sound that with each stroke of the sweep grew into a more distinct, cataract-like roar. It was the river. Swollen by flood, it was a terrifying sound. But Kent did not dread it. It was his river. It was his friend. It was the pulse and throb of life to him now. The growing tumult of it was not menace, but the joyous thunder of many voices calling to him, rejoicing at his coming. It grew in his ears. Over his head the black sky opened again, and a deluge of rain fell straight down. But above the sound of it, the rush of the river drew nearer and still nearer. He felt the first eddying swirl of it against the scow head, and powerful hands seemed to reach in out of the darkness. He knew that the nose of the current had caught him and was carrying him out on the breast of the stream. He shipped the sweep and straightened himself, facing the utter chaos of blackness ahead. He felt under him the slow and mighty pulse of the great flood as it swept toward the Slave, the Mackenzie, and the Arctic. And he cried out at last in the downpour of storm a cry of joy, of exultation, of hope that reached beyond the laws of men. And then he turned toward the little cabin, where through the thickness of sodden night the tiny window was glowing yellow with candlelight. End of chapter 18. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 19 of The Valley of Silent Men. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Valley of Silent Men by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 19. To the cabin Kent groped his way, and knocked, and it was Marette who opened the door for him and stepped back for him to enter. Like a great wet dog he came in, doubling until his hands almost touched the floor. He sensed the incongruity of it, the misplacement of his overgrown body in this playhouse thing, and he grinned through the trickles of wet that ran down his face, and tried to see. Marette had taken off her turban and raincoat, and she, too, stooped low in the 4 feet space of the cabin, but not so ridiculously low as Kent. He dropped on his knees again. And then he saw in the tiny stove a fire was burning. The crackle of it rose above the beat of the rain on the roof, and the air was already mellowing with the warmth of it. He looked at Marette. Her wet hair was still clinging to her face, her feet and arms and part of her body were wet, but her eyes were shining, and she was smiling at him. She seemed to him, in this moment, like a child that was glad it had found refuge. He had thought that the terror of the night would show in her face, but it was gone. She was not thinking of the thunder and the lightning, the black trail, or of Kedsty lying dead in his bungalow. She was thinking of him. He laughed outright. It was a joyous, thrilling thing, this black night with the storm over their heads and the roll of the great river under them. They two, alone, in this cockleshell cabin that was not high enough to stand in, and scarcely big enough in any direction to turn around in. The snug cheer of it, the warmth of the fire beginning to reach their chilled bodies, and the inspiring crackle of the birch in the little stove filled Kent, for a space, with other thoughts than those of the world they were leaving. And Marette, whose eyes and lips were smiling at him softly in the candle glow, seemed also to have forgotten. It was the little window that brought them back to the tragedy of their flight. Kent visioned it as it must look from the shore, a telltale blotch of light traveling through the darkness. There were occasional cabins for several miles below the landing, and eyes turned riverward in the storm might see it. He made his way to the window and fastened his slicker over it. "We're off, Gray Goose," he said then, rubbing his hands. "Would it seem more homelike if I smoked?" She nodded, her eyes on the slicker at the window. "It's pretty safe," said Kent, fishing out his pipe and beginning to fill it. "Everybody asleep, probably. But we won't take any chances." The scow was swinging sideways in the current. Kent felt the change in its movement, and added, "No danger of being wrecked, either. There isn't a rock or rapids for 30 miles. River clear as a floor. If we bump ashore, don't get frightened." "I'm not afraid of the river," she said. Then, with rather startling unexpectedness, she asked him, "Where will they look for us tomorrow?" Kent lighted his pipe, eyeing her a bit speculatively as she seated herself on the stool, leaning toward him as she waited for an answer to her question. "The woods, the river, everywhere," he said. "They'll look for a missing boat, of course. We've simply got to watch behind us and take advantage of a good start." "Will the rain wipe out our footprints, Jeems?" "Yes, everything in the open." "But perhaps in a sheltered place?" "We were in no sheltered place," he assured her. "Can you remember that we were, Gray Goose?" She shook her head slowly. "No, but there was Mooie under the window." "His footprints will be wiped out." "I am glad. I would not have him, or M'sieu Fingers, or any of our friends brought into this trouble." She made no effort to hide the relief his words brought her. He was a little amazed that she should worry over Fingers and the old Indian in this hour of their own peril. That danger he had decided to keep as far from her mind as possible. But she could not help realizing the impending menace of it. She must know that within a few hours Kedsty would be found, and the long arm of the wilderness police would begin its work. And if it caught them... She had thrust her feet toward him and was wriggling them inside her boots, so that he heard the slushing sound of water. "Ugh, but they are wet," she shivered. "Will you unlace them and pull them off for me, Jeems?" He laid his pipe aside and knelt close to her. It took him 5 minutes to get the boots off. Then he held one of her sodden little feet close between his two big hands. "Cold, cold as ice," he said. "You must take off your stockings, Marette. Please." He arranged a pile of wood in front of the stove and covered it with a blanket which he pulled from one of the bunks. Then, still on his knees, he drew the cane chair close to the fire and covered it with a second blanket. A few moments later Marette was tucked comfortably in this chair, with her bare feet on the blanketed pile of wood. Kent opened the stove door. Then he extinguished one of the smoking candles, and after that the other. The flaming birch illumined the little cabin with a mellower light. It gave a subdued flush to the girl's face. Her eyes seemed to Kent wonderfully soft and beautiful in that changed light. And when he had finished, she reached out a hand, and for an instant it touched his face and his wet hair so lightly that he sensed the thrilling caress of it without feeling its weight. "You are so good to me, Jeems," she said, and he thought there was a little choking note in her throat. He had seated himself on the floor, close to her chair, with his back to the wall. "It is because I love you, Gray Goose," he replied quietly, looking straight into the fire. She was silent. She, too, was looking into the fire. Close over their heads they heard the beating of the rain, like 1,000 soft little fists pounding the top of the cabin. Under them they could feel the slow swinging of the scow as it responded to the twists and vagaries of the current that was carrying them on. And Kent, unseen by the girl who was looking away from him, raised his eyes. The birch light was glowing in her hair. It trembled on her white throat. Her long lashes were caught in the shimmer of it. And, looking at her, Kent thought of Kedsty lying back in his bungalow room, choked to death by a tress of that glorious hair, so near to him now that, by leaning a little forward, he might have touched it with his lips. The thought brought him no horror, for even as he looked, one of her hands crept up to her cheek, the small, soft hand that had touched his face and hair as lightly as a bit of thistle down, and he knew that two hands like that could not have killed a man who was fighting for life when he died. And Kent reached up and took the hand, and held it close in his own as he said, "Little Gray Goose, please tell me now. What happened in Kedsty's room?" His voice thrilled with an immeasurable faith. He wanted her to know, no matter what had happened, that his faith and his love for her could not be shaken. He believed in her, and would always believe in her. Already he was sure that he knew how Kedsty had died. The picture of the tragedy had pieced itself together in his mind, bit by bit. While he slept, Marette and a man were down in the big room with the inspector of police. The climax had come, and Kedsty was struck a blow, in some unaccountable way, with his own gun. Then, just as Kedsty was recovering sufficiently from the shock of the blow to fight, Marette's companion had killed him. Horrified, dazed by what had already happened, perhaps unconscious, she had been powerless to prevent the use of a tress of her hair in the murderer's final work. Kent, in this picture, eliminated the bootlaces and the curtain cords. He knew that the unusual and the least expected happened frequently in crime. And Marette's long hair was flowing loose about her. To use it had simply been the first inspiration of the murderer. And Kent believed, as he waited for her answer now, that Marette would tell him this. And as he waited, he felt her fingers tighten in his hand. "Tell me, Gray Goose, what happened?" "I don't know, Jeems." His eyes went to her suddenly from the fire, as if he was not quite sure he had heard what she had said. She did not move her head, but continued to gaze unseeingly into the flames. Inside his palm her fingers worked to his thumb and held it tightly again, as they had clung to it when she was frightened by the thunder and lightning. "I don't know what happened, Jeems." This time he did not feel the clinging thrill of her little fingers and soft palm. Deep within him he experienced something that was like a sudden and unexpected blow. He was ready to fight for her until his last breath was gone. He was ready to believe anything she told him, anything except this impossible thing which she had just spoken. For she did know what had happened in Kedsty's room. She knew, unless... Suddenly his heart leaped with joyous hope. "You mean you were unconscious?" he cried in a low voice that trembled with his eagerness. "You fainted, and it happened then?" She shook her head. "No, I was asleep in my room. I didn't intend to sleep, but I did. Something awakened me. I thought I had been dreaming, but something kept pulling me downstairs. And when I went, I found Kedsty like that. He was dead. I was paralyzed, standing there when you came." She drew her hand away from him, gently but significantly. "I know you can't believe me, Jeems. It is impossible for you to believe me." "And you don't want me to believe you, Marette?" "Yes, I do. You must believe me." "But the tress of hair, your hair, round Kedsty's neck." He stopped. His words, spoken gently as they were, seemed brutal to him. Yet he could not see that they affected her. She did not flinch. He saw no tremor of horror. Steadily she continued to look into the fire. and his brain grew confused. Never in all his experience had he seen such absolute and unaffected self-control. And somehow it chilled him. It chilled him even as he wanted to reach out and gather her close in his arms, and pour his love into her ears, entreating her to tell him everything, to keep nothing back from him that might help in the fight he was going to make. And then she said, "Jeems, if we should be caught by the police, it would probably be quite soon, wouldn't it?" "They won't catch us." "But our greatest danger of being caught is right now, isn't it?" she insisted. Kent took out his watch and leaned over to look at it in the fire-glow. "It is 3 o'clock," he said. "Give me another day and night, Gray Goose, and the police will never find us." For a moment or two more she was silent. Then her hand reached out, and her fingers twined softly around his thumb again. "Jeems, when we are safe, when we are sure the police won't find us, I will tell you all that I know about what happened in Kedsty's room. And I will tell you about the hair. I will tell you everything." Her fingers tightened almost fiercely. "Everything," she repeated. "I will tell you about that in Kedsty's room, and I will tell you about myself. And after that, I am afraid you won't like me." "I love you," he said, making no movement to touch her. "No matter what you tell me, Gray Goose, I shall love you." She gave a little cry, scarcely more than a broken note in her throat, and Kent, had her face been turned toward him then, would have seen the glory that came into it, and into her eyes, like a swift flash of light, and passed as swiftly away. What he did see, when she turned her head, were eyes caught suddenly by something at the cabin door. He looked. Water was trickling in slowly over the sill. "I expected that," he said cheerfully. "Our scow is turning into a rain barrel, Marette. Unless I bail out, we'll soon be flooded." He reached for his slicker and put it on. "It won't take me long to throw the water overboard," he added. "And while I'm doing that, I want you to take off your wet things and tuck yourself into bed. Will you, Gray Goose?" "I'm not tired, but if you think it is best—" Her hand touched his arm. "It is best," he said, and for a moment he bent over her until his lips touched her hair. Then he seized a pail and went out into the rain. End of chapter 19. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 20 of The Valley of Silent Men. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Valley of Silent Men by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 20. It was that hour when, with clear skies, the gray northern dawn would have been breaking faintly over the eastern forests. Kent found the darkness more fog-like. About him was a grayer, ghostlier sort of gloom. But he could not see the water under his feet, nor could he see the rail of the scow or the river. From the stern, 10 feet from the cabin door, the cabin itself was swallowed up and invisible. With the steady, swinging motion of the riverman he began bailing. So regular became his movements that they ran in a sort of rhythmic accompaniment to his thoughts. The monotonous splash, splash, splash of the outflung pails of water assumed, after a few minutes, the character of a mechanical thing. He could smell the nearness of the shore. Even in the rain, the tang of cedar and balsam came to him faintly. But it was the river that impressed itself most upon his senses. It seemed to him, as the minutes passed, like a living thing. He could hear it gurgling and playing under the end of the scow. And with that sound there was another and more indescribable thing, the tremble of it, the pulse of it, the thrill of it in the impenetrable gloom, the life of it, as it swept on in a slow and mighty flood between its wilderness walls. Kent had always said, "You can hear the river's heartbeat if you know how to listen for it." And he heard it now. He felt it. The rain could not beat it out, nor could the splash of the water he was throwing overboard drown it, and the darkness could not hide it from the vision that was burning like a living coal within him. Always it was the river that had given him consolation in times of loneliness. For him it had grown into a thing with a soul, a thing that personified hope, courage, comradeship, everything that was big and great in final achievement. And tonight, for he still thought of the darkness as night, the soul of it seemed whispering to him a sort of paean. He could not lose. That was the thought that filled him. Never had his pulse beat with greater assurance, never had a more positive sense of the inevitable possessed him. It was inconceivable, he thought, even to fear the possibility of being taken by the police. He was more than a man fighting for his freedom alone, more than an individual struggling for the right to exist. A thing vastly more priceless than either freedom or life, if they were to be accepted alone, waited for him in the little cabin, shut in by its sea of darkness. And ahead of them lay their world. He emphasized that. Their world. The world which, in an elusive and unreal sort of way, had been a part of his dreams all his life. In that world they would shut themselves in. No one would ever find them. And the glory of the sun and the stars and God's open country would be with them always. Marette was the very heart of that reality which impinged itself upon him now. He did not worry about what it was she would tell him tomorrow, or day after tomorrow. He believed that it was then, when she had told him what there was to tell and he still reached out his arms to her, that she would have come into those arms. And he knew that nothing that might have happened in Kedsty's room would keep his arms from reaching to her. Such was his faith, potent as the mighty flood hidden in the gray ghost gloom of approaching dawn. Yet he did not expect to win easily. As he worked, his mind swept up and down the three rivers from the Landing to Fort Simpson, and mentally he pictured the situations that might arise, and how he would triumph over them. He figured that the man at barracks would not enter Kedsty's bungalow until noon at the earliest. The police gasoline launch would probably set out on a river search soon after. By mid-afternoon the scow would have a 50-mile start. Before darkness came again they would be through the Death Chute, where Follette and La Douceur swam their mad race for the love of a girl. And not many miles below the chute was a swampy country where he could hide the scow. Then they would start overland, west and north. Given until another sunset, and they would be safe. This was what he expected. But if it came to fighting, he would fight. The rain had slackened to a thin drizzle by the time he finished his bailing. The aroma of cedar and balsam came up to him more clearly, and he heard more distinctly the murmuring surge of the river. He tapped again at the door of the cabin, and Marette answered him. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing coals when he entered. Again he fell on his knees, and took off his dripping slicker. The girl greeted him from the berth. "You look like a great bear, Jeems." There was a glad, welcoming note in her voice. He laughed, and drew the stool beside her, and managed to sit on it, the roof compelling him to bend his head over a little. "I feel like an elephant in a bird cage," he replied. "Are you comfortable, little Gray Goose?" "Yes. But you, Jeems, you are wet." "But so happy that I don't feel it, Gray Goose." He could make her out only dimly there in the darkness of the berth. Her face was a pale shadow, and she had loosened her damp hair so that the warmth and dry air might reach it more easily. Kent wondered if she could hear the beating of his heart. He forgot the fire, and the darkness grew thicker. He could no longer see the pale outline of her face, and he drew back a little, possessed by the thought that it was sacrilegious to bend nearer to her like a thief in that gloom. She sensed his movement, and her hand reached to him and lay lightly with its fingertips touching his arm. "Jeems," she said softly, "I'm not sorry now that I came up to Cardigan's place that day when you thought you were dying. I wasn't wrong. You are different. And I made fun of you then, and laughed at you, because I knew that you were not going to die. Will you forgive me?" He laughed happily. "It's funny how little things work out sometimes," he said. "Wasn't a king lost once upon a time because some fellow didn't have a horseshoe? Anyway, I knew of a man whose life was saved because of a broken pipe stem. And you came to me, and I'm here with you now, because—" "Of what?" she whispered. "Because of something that happened a long time ago," he said. "Something you wouldn't dream could have anything to do with you or with me. Shall I tell you about it, Marette?" Her fingers pressed slightly upon his arm. "Yes." "Of course, it's a story of the police," he began. "And I won't mention this fellow's name. You may think of him as that red-headed O'Connor if you want to, but I don't say that it was he. He was a constable in the service and had been away north looking up some Indians who were brewing an intoxicating liquor from roots. That was 6 years ago. And he caught something. Le Mort Rouge, we sometimes call it, the Red Death, or smallpox. And he was alone when the fever knocked him down, 300 miles from anywhere. His Indian ran away at the first sign of it, and he had just time to get up his tent before he was flat on his back. I won't try to tell you of the days he went through. It was a living death. And he would have died, there is no doubt of it, if it hadn't been for a stranger who came along. He was a white man. Marette, it doesn't take a great deal of nerve to go up against a man with a gun, when you've got a gun of your own, and it doesn't take such a lot of nerve to go into battle when 1,000 others are going with you. But it does take nerve to face what that stranger faced. And the sick man was nothing to him. He went into that tent and nursed the other back to life. Then the sickness got him, and for 10 weeks those two were together, each fighting to save the other's life, and they won out. But the glory of it was with the stranger. He was going west. The constable was going south. They shook hands and parted. Marette's fingers tightened on Kent's arm, and Kent went on. And the constable never forgot, Gray Goose. He wanted the day to come when he might repay. And the time came. It was years later, and it worked out in a curious way. A man was murdered. And the constable, who had become a sergeant now, had talked with the dead man only a little while before he was killed. Returning for something he had forgotten, it was the sergeant who found him dead. Very shortly afterward, a man was arrested. There was blood on his clothing. The evidence was convincing, deadly. And this man—" Kent paused, and in the darkness Marette's hand crept down his arm to his hand, and her fingers closed around it. "Was the man you lied to save," she whispered. "Yes. When the half-breed's bullet got me, I thought it was a good chance to repay Sandy McTrigger for what he did for me in that tent years before. But it wasn't heroic. It wasn't even brave. I thought I was going to die, and that I was risking nothing." And then there came a soft, joyous little laugh from where her head lay on the pillow. "And all the time you were lying so splendidly. Jeems, I knew," she cried. "I knew that you didn't kill Barkley, and I knew that you weren't going to die, and I knew what happened in that tent 10 years ago. And Jeems, Jeems—" She raised herself from the pillow. Her breath was coming a little excitedly. Both her hands, instead of one, were gripping his hand now. "I knew that you didn't kill John Barkley," she repeated. "And Sandy McTrigger didn't kill him." "But—" "He didn't," she interrupted him almost fiercely. "He was innocent as you were. Jeems, I know who killed Barkley. Oh, I know. A choking sob came into her throat, and then she added, in a voice which she was straining to make calm, "Don't think I haven't faith in you because I can't tell you more now, Jeems," she said. "You will understand quite soon. When we are safe from the police I shall tell you. I shall keep nothing from you then. I shall tell you about Barkley and Kedsty, everything. But I can't now. It won't be long. When you tell me we are safe I shall believe you. And then—" She withdrew her hands from his and dropped back on her pillow. "And then what?" he asked, leaning far over. "You may not like me, Jeems." "I love you," he whispered. "Nothing in the world can stop my loving you." "Even if I tell you soon that I killed Barkley?" "No. You would be lying." "Or if I told you that I killed Kedsty?" "No matter what you said, or what proof there might be back there, I would not believe you." She was silent. And then, "Jeems." "Yes, Niska, little goddess." "I'm going to tell you something now." He waited. "It is going to shock you, Jeems." He felt her arms reaching up. Her two hands touched his shoulders. "Are you listening?" "Yes, I am listening." "Because I'm not going to say it very loud." And then she whispered, "Jeems, I love you." End of chapter 20. Recording by Roger Moline.